This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Fatigue Fixer podcast. Ever wonder why it feels like the entire sisterhood is just so darn exhausted? We're diving deep into everything from those sneaky physical culprits, think iron levels playing hide and seek or a moody thyroid, to the mental weights of always being on and that sneaky urge to please everyone. And let's not forget society's oh-so-high bar that we're tirelessly trying to reach. I'm Dr. Sarah Vedbonkar, your guide on this energy-finding mission. As a naturopathic doctor with over a decade of experience, I've been piecing together the fatigue puzzle, asking why so many incredible women around me, including my patients, often feel like they're running on empty. So pull up a chair or perhaps pop in your headphones and head out for a walk. Together we'll uncover those hidden, surprising, and sometimes even downright unexpected reasons behind that lingering tiredness. Ready to recharge those batteries? All right, deep breath. Let's jump into today's insightful episode. Last weekend, I was cleaning out my closet, putting away summer dresses and taking out my fall sweaters, and I found the pile. You know, the one full of clothes that don't fit you, but that you keep around just in case. One day you might fit into them again. And in that pile for me are two pairs of very expensive, very nice designer jeans. A few years ago, I decided I was finally going to splurge and buy myself some nice jeans. I had been literally wearing $20 Costco jeans for years. And so I was ready to buy something nice. And so I bought them. And literally within probably 18 months or 2 years, they did not fit me anymore. Maybe you've been there too recently. So in that moment, as I saw those jeans in that pile, I was faced with a decision. Do I go on a diet to try to fit back into these beautiful, expensive jeans? Or do I just go out and buy new pants? Now, I've done a lot of work over the years on accepting and even growing to love my body. So for me, it was a fairly easy decision: buy new pants. But I've noticed the opposite to be true in so many of the women that I see in my clinical practice. They don't want to buy new pants. They want to fit back into the ones they already have. And they often have this expectation that their body should stay the same even as they're going through their menopause transition. So that's what we're exploring today in the one where your jeans don't fit anymore. What expectations do we have about midlife bodies, and are we exhausting ourselves trying to fit into our clothes? My guest today is a breath of fresh air in the growing number of voices in the menopause space. Dr. Jenn Salib is a Canadian registered dietitian, naturopathic doctor, and intuitive eating counselor, and she's on a mission to help women manage menopause without diets and food rules. She helps women navigate the physical and emotional changes that happen in perimenopause and menopause, including their search for food freedom and body confidence. Working from a health at every size approach, she teaches women to become intuitive eaters and build body confidence at any stage of midlife. In addition to her one-on-one and group programs, she's the host of the Midlife Feast podcast and community that helps women undiet their lives after 40 so they can nourish a relationship with food that helps them discover the magic of midlife. Yes, because it can be magical. Even if your pants don't fit, it can be magical.
That needs to be on a t-shirt.
It does. That's going to be the tagline of the episode today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here because you really are someone that I turn to in those moments where I get sucked back into that diet culture nonsense and that's part of what I want to talk about today is understanding why so many women have a weight loss goal, because you can't breathe the air on this planet without being told that skinnier is better, weight loss is healthier, dieting is your ticket to get there. And so I get why so many women have weight loss goals, but I also know from my own experience and from following practitioners like you that there is a different way. And that's really what I want us to dive into today. So welcome. Let you talk for a second.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously love talking about this, but I love the story that you shared at the beginning, because I think that is going to be such a relatable moment for anyone in any stage, but especially people in midlife who often feel like they had everything figured out until perimenopause hit. And then it's like the gloves come off, the rules change, they have no idea what game they're playing, and they feel broken. So I think that's a great story to start with. But to kind of answer the question of like, why do we feel this way? Why are we so attached to the number on the scale? It often goes back to the programming and the messaging that we received from way, way, way back. So many of us in this age and stage, but I think really at any age, we're exposed to families and friends and talk of bodies. Even if you weren't put on a diet, even if your mom didn't diet, although there are lots of us who have that in our history, there was talk about bodies, and the message was received loud and clear from a very early age that the worst thing that could happen to you was for your body to get bigger. And that for women especially, and people I guess who identify as women, that if your body got bigger and you got old, that your worth and your value was done. Mm-hmm. So, to be in that age and stage where things are happening to you because of hormone changes, you can't control them. It's scary as hell. It's really terrifying.
So when you have like the women that you work with, when they're going through this stage where they are noticing kind of changes that probably some of them are resisting or actively fighting against, how do you start to talk to them about kind of what's normal or what can we expect in terms of our bodies changing as we go through perimenopause and menopause?
Yeah, and to back things up for people who are maybe really new to perimenopause and aren't sure what's happening, in perimenopause, we have this roller coaster of hormones that can happen for years, sometimes up to a decade, where, no 2 months are alike. And so, as I call it, the hormone soup that we're swimming in changes dramatically when we get to perimenopause. Things stabilize relatively into a new normal in postmenopause, but perimenopause is often when people will start to notice these changes. And so they'll often say, my clothes aren't fitting. And even if the scale hasn't changed, there is a redistribution of assets, as I call it, because of these hormonal changes. And so if you were someone who identified as a pear shape, you are more likely to notice some apple features in the mirror, which means that how your clothes fit, where your jeans land on your waistline. I was joking the other day with someone that I have no idea where my butt went. I'm now in postmenopause and I'm like, where did it go? So we have this redistribution of assets that happen that's pre-programmed into our DNA. We cannot spot reduce. We cannot change that willfully. We also have a combination of life things that are happening. We tend to be well established in our jobs. And unless your job or career, if you do have a career outside the home, unless that career is very active, chances are you're spending more time sitting in your 40s and 50s than you did in your 20s and 30s. Even if you have kids like I do, I'm not running after them anymore because they're teenagers and they lock themselves in their room most of the time. They're not toddlers that I have to chase all day long. So a lot of our daily activity levels have changed. We have these hormone changes that can be impacting sleep. We know that sleep can impact potentially metabolism, but certainly impacts appetite, cravings. We have all of the emotional hunger that is created by all of the emotions around perimenopause. So there's a lot going on. So if anybody thinks that like this is a simple problem with a simple fix that's going to be resolved by cutting out carbs, I'm really sorry to say that's not the case.
You heard it here first, people. Cutting carbs is not going to fix it. And we're going to get into that because there are some pretty ridiculous things being recommended to women in this stage, and I want to dive into some of those. But one of the things that I see and hear all the time in my practice is a woman comes in, she's like, nothing's changed. I'm eating the same, I'm exercising the same, and now I'm putting on weight. Like, what the heck is happening? And I think part of the like tough love conversation that sometimes needs to happen is that your habits may have been pretty good, but they might not be enough to support, like you said, the massive hormonal change that's happening. So maybe that like going to bed at midnight, which is an hour later than your body actually needs, and you've been doing that for 10 years, that glass of wine or two that you're having to unwind, like all of those things, those habits, they add up over time, and it often feels like they start, that's what I've noticed, they start to kind of catch up with us a little bit more in our 40s, or we can't, like, get away is not the right word, but our bodies tell us more clearly when they don't like some of the things that we're doing. Is that something that you're seeing as well or hearing?
Yeah, I mean, that also needs to be on a t-shirt, because I think every conversation I have with people starts with, I'm not doing anything differently. If anything, I'm doing more of the things I should be doing, and it's still not working. And it is a more complex and nuanced conversation, because for some people who are chronic dieters, who have fallen into that yo-yo dieting, weight cycling, kind of rhythm, there may be some metabolic adaptation that has started to take place. So, it may be that it truly is harder for the things that used to work in the way that they used to. So that may be happening. The other thing that may be happening, though, is that the habits that used to serve you, like you mentioned, may not have adjusted to the age and stage that you're in. And so, things like alcohol really disrupt sleep. They often disrupt other things. So in intuitive eating, we talk about alcohol as being an attunement disruptor. It's very difficult to tune into your hunger and fullness cues, if you've had a couple glasses of wine. The other thing is, the reason why we might be reaching for the wine might be because we're stressed and anxious. So it really kind of layers in so many different pieces of that puzzle. But the other thing is that weight isn't a behavior. And so it's not something that you choose. And I use the analogy of the back of a watch. So if you take the back off of a watch and you see all of these moving parts, one will be food, one will be movement. And the others are all these interconnected and related pieces that are sometimes, genetics, sleep, stress, anxiety, hormones, medication, health, all of these pieces of the puzzle that we can't willfully control. So I try and teach this weight neutrality or body neutrality focus, which is to say, intuitive eating isn't anti-weight loss. You don't have to think about never losing weight again, but don't make it the be all and end all, because it isn't the thing that you have the most control over.
Yeah, I think that's so important, because we do get this message that, like, if you just eat better and exercise more, you'll have the weight loss. And that is a very important part of the equation. But like you said, when women are going through this transition, there's so many other factors that influence both those things. Right? Yeah. When you're tired and you feel like shit, you're probably going to choose a different food, and you're potentially going to move your body less. And I think sometimes those changes are very subtle, that women don't even realize that they are taking 3,000 steps fewer per day than they did 10 years ago. It feels the same, but it might not actually be the same. And one of the things that I want to highlight, because I think it's so important for women to know, is that we do see an increase in disordered eating behaviors around women at midlife. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happens for women?
So midlife and perimenopause especially is often referred to as reverse puberty. And the changes that are happening in the brain in perimenopause aren't all that dissimilar from what happens in puberty. And we know that because of the changes in the brain that happen with estrogen, especially in progesterone, there is an increase in body dissatisfaction and body dysmorphia. And so it's a really important thing to mention. And I'm so glad that you brought it up, because for many women who have had maybe years of disordered eating, this sometimes, tips them over into a clinical eating disorder. And when a lot of the things that they're doing are validated and supported under the umbrella of health and wellness, it becomes even trickier for them or the people around them to see it as a problem, especially if they don't fit the stereotype. And so, the number of people who who meet the criteria for an eating disorder who are not in a very small body is not insignificant. So I think that that's a really important point to make.
Yeah.
And just to kind of add to the conversation before, that, it's not that the calorie in, calorie out equation isn't real.
Mm-hmm.
It's that our ability and willingness to control it and need to control it changes. And that's okay. If I don't have the capacity or don't want to devote all of my capacity to managing that, I can still be healthy and happy in the body that I have. I don't have to be a number or a size. And that is kind of the take-home message that I try and get people to focus on, is that how you feel in your body is going to matter 1,000 times more than whether or not you can fit in the jeans. Even if at the moment it feels like the jeans are the most important thing. They're not, because once you get them out of the house, you don't think about them anymore because you're living in your body.
Yeah. And also when you're wearing pants that actually fit you, you're not reminded of having something digging into your stomach and being uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
Wearing clothes that fit you seems like such like a simple and obvious thing, but it's actually very empowering to be like, no, I'm actually just going to dress the body I have instead of letting my clothes police me and remind me every single day that I am not the size that I was when I bought these pants. And I was thinking about this recently, and you just brought it up. Like, we would never try to interfere with a girl's body changing in puberty, right? We don't judge it. It can be very difficult when you're the girl going through it. It's not an easy transition, but we don't try to change it and stop it. And yet we have this completely unrealistic expectation, I believe, that our bodies should magically stay the same throughout all of adulthood, when hormonally and functionally, a body that is 30 has very different goals and needs than a body that is 45 or 55.
Yeah. And I would like to say that it is hopefully more true now that we don't try and correct the process of a body changing at puberty. But the entry point into dieting and diet culture for girls has historically been around the normal body changes that happen at puberty. So our body fat percentage has to dramatically increase, sometimes double, in order to achieve and maintain menstruation. And it is often that rapid change in a 9, 10, 11-year-old body that had prompted or prompts that entry into diet culture. I could write and fill a book with stories with people who went to their first Weight Watchers meeting when they were 11. So we normalize those changes now. And it seems crazy to think about trying to stop that. But for many people, that was their first moment of body shame, was puberty.
Yeah. I remember specifically the first time I was aware of my body, I was in grade 5. And for some reason, they were doing these ID cards. This was the 80s. I don't know if they were worried we're going to get abducted. I don't know what the heck was going on. But I specifically remember they weighed us and they measured us. And I remember I weighed 97 pounds and I remember feeling ashamed. I was in grade 5.
Wow.
So I already knew, I had already learned somewhere, somehow, that higher weight is bad news when you're a girl. So yes, this stuff does start early. And I think part of what we internalize and part of what we learn so early is that our ticket to thinness and our ticket to weight is control. I have to control my food. I have to control how much and what I eat. I need to do the exercise. And what I've seen is that the more I tried to control my food, the more out of control I felt around food. And this is something I try to explain to patients, that the more you restrict and control, the more you're actually causing binging, overeating, and feelings of being out of control. And I think when we feel out of control around food, most people's tendency is to go back to the restriction and the controlling, and it fuels this constant like back and forth. And for me, what really completely changed my relationship around food is when I decided that I was going to operate with 0 food rules.
Yep.
And if you're listening to this, that might sound scary as hell, and that's okay. But listen, just stick with me for a second. By removing all the food rules and giving myself permission to eat whatever I want, it has allowed me to have, right now, I have Haagen-Dazs ice cream sitting in my freezer. Am I thinking about the ice cream? Am I trying to convince myself not to eat the ice cream? No, because I have given myself full permission to eat the ice cream if I want it. So it has become like a non-issue. So can you talk to us a little bit more about this concept of food freedom and like what does that actually mean?
Yes. So food freedom is such a great term. And I think when people first hear it, especially if they're coming from any kind of background of trying to control food, what they actually hear is free for all. And so initially, and especially I think if people are trying to always do this on their own, they're like, oh, food freedom, no food rules. Great. I'm just going to eat whatever I want, whenever I want. Food freedom is more nuanced than that because it does mean food neutrality. There are no good foods, no bad foods. We don't have to have rules around what we can and can't have. There aren't, we don't have to worry about foods being addictive in and of themselves. And so when we talk about food freedom, what we're really talking about is the permission to say yes or the permission to say no, believing that it is your choice. And when we can believe that it's a choice, it feels like a very easy decision to make. If you know that you could have Haagen-Dazs 3 times a day if you wanted it, that there's nothing stopping you from doing that, it's very easy to choose whether you want to or not. But if you think that you can only have it on Friday because Friday's cheat day and you've gone to the gym and you've done all the things to earn it, it is going to be impossible to ever feel like you've had enough to feel satisfied. And the way that our brain works around restriction is that when we restrict something, it actually creates anticipation and craving, and our brain gets rewarded for that anticipation. So when I'm talking to people about trying to kind of work towards this food freedom, I say, you have to trust the process of saying yes. And just kind of learning that, oh, if I say yes the first time I think about it, I don't think about it 100 times. If I say yes on a Tuesday at lunchtime, instead of waiting until Friday night, I feel less anticipation and reward from having it. So the process of unlearning what you think you need to do to control your food does involve a lot of trust because you have to trust the process. But as you've seen, it really does bring us to this place where food is just neutral. It's just food. It's not reward. It's not punishment. It's just food. It's a decision that I have to make several times a day, multiple, every day of the week. I have to decide what to eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and for other people. So it can't be difficult. It can't require a lot of my brain power to make that decision because it's one I have to make all the time.
Yeah. And this is why this topic is such like a passion project for me, is that I see the amount of energy and time women spend thinking about, planning for, trying not to eat. Like, we use so much of our precious energy trying to control our food. And I can only dream of what would be possible for us if we released that energy.
Yeah.
Because to me, that is one of the worst uses of our precious time and energy, is constantly obsessing about and controlling and trying not to eat certain foods, I feel like that energy would be better spent doing literally anything else than that. For women who are listening and who just heard you say there are no good foods and bad foods and whose heads are exploding because they're like, what do you mean? Artificial sweeteners are bad and lectins and carbs and all the things. So for someone who's like coming at this conversation still steeped in diet culture, which I would argue we all are, just some, more than others, how do you start to have women, like from a practical perspective or maybe from like a mindset shift, how do you get them to start to practice this food neutrality?
So there's kind of two parts to this process. So a lot of people will, especially if they have dieted their whole life or if they've tried to follow a plan or eat clean or whatever, this idea of not following a plan sounds very exciting. So often they jump in with like both feet. But there's a difference between not dieting and intuitive eating. And so when we start to think about the undieting process, we have to figure out like, where did these beliefs come from? Where were the seeds planted that you had to control food? And where have those messages been reinforced? Are they being reinforced in healthcare conversations? Are they being reinforced in your friends and your family around you? And so that's kind of part A. But the second part is looking at intuitive eating through the principle of gentle nutrition, which I love because it acknowledges that food matters. It just doesn't matter in the way that we used to think or the way that we used to believe. And so we can have conversations around food, but we try and tie it to the aspect of the food that we want to focus on with that nutrient kind of density in mind. So protein isn't good. It's just a source of protein that helps to build muscle and stabilize our blood sugar. Sugar isn't bad, but if we only ate sugar, we would probably feel like a steaming pile of garbage. But in and of itself, it's not going to cause harm. And so, or like vegetables aren't good for us. They're, great sources of fiber and antioxidants. And so when we start to attach less morality to the food and focus more on the nutrients in the food, but again, without that attachment to morality, it becomes so much easier to just say, oh, okay, one of my nutrition goals is to try and build and maintain muscle in midlife. Great. What are the sources of protein that I can include? But you don't have to exclude things. So we talk about adding in and nutrition by addition as really that fundamental concept of how to stay out of the diet mentality. So that's kind of usually how we start, is permission, but also trying to think about gentle nutrition.
I love that. And that's how I try to approach this conversation is, what do we want to add back in? Like, what do we want to prioritize as opposed to a diet being defined by what's absent or what's missing from it? There are so one of the good things that's happened over the last couple of years is that there's been a spotlight finally put on women in midlife, women going through perimenopause and menopause. And I think it's fantastic. However, it also means that there's been an explosion in people giving advice, specifically nutrition advice, to women going through this stage. And some of it is harmful, in my opinion. What are some of the trends that you're seeing or some of the recommendations that you see women try to follow that you're like really shaking your head at, that you feel are not ideal for this age and stage?
I don't know how much time we have, Sarah. Well, I mean, carbs always top the list because I feel like it has been the longest standing one that, that carbs are problematic in and of themselves, that they cause us to gain weight, that they cause diabetes, that they cause all of these things. But there really isn't any good evidence to support that. And when we look at especially long-term studies, observational studies, looking at populations of people who live the longest and the healthiest, guess what's in their diet? Carbs.
Yep.
And yes, there definitely is a little bit more of an association with whole grain carbohydrates, probably because of the fiber component. But again, we're talking like 45, 55% of total dietary intake coming from carbohydrates being associated with better health. Like when I tell people that, they're like, "Oh, but wait a minute. Why have I never heard about this?"
Yeah.
Because it's just so easy, I think, for well-intended, even healthcare professionals to say, "Oh, cut your carbs." But when we cut carbs, we're cutting satisfaction. We're cutting joy. We're cutting our brain and red blood cells' preferred fuel source. And we're cutting fiber. Like we're cutting out all of these things that actually add to our health. So anybody who's worried about carbs, just let that go.
Yes.
Just let that go.
If you take one thing from today, it's like let go of the carb fear.
Yeah.
It's
the carb fear, the carb phobia, the hate on carbs. I mean, every culture in the world has bread and carbohydrates, right? Like we thrive when we include them as part of a balanced plate. The other one is kind of the very trendy personalized nutrition. And so whether it is using like continuous glucose monitors to like measure your blood sugar 24 hours a day, or looking to see what gut microbes are living in your gut, or any of like the fancy calculators that try and like tell you exactly what you should have. We don't have any science to support that. Like we have like small studies, we have, conclusions that have been generalized in ways that shouldn't be. And we really don't have any good data to say that that helps people to be healthier. And so regardless of your relationship with food, which I think it obviously would harm, it's a false prophet. And so, data is not information if it isn't actually true. Right. It's just a shiny squirrel. And yes, we're all like drawn to the light when something and shiny is new is out there. But it's not really going to help that much. I saw something the other day that was a great comparison. It's like MyFitnessPal didn't make everyone healthy either. Right. So like this is like the new variation of that. And so people who feel like they need to spend hundreds of dollars on a medical device that has not been studied or approved for the use that it is being sold for can save their money. But the third one is probably around fasting. So I try and talk people out of fasting all the time because I joke, and maybe I shouldn't joke about it, but that I almost need to run like a fasting rehab.
Yes, you do.
Because people who try it, even like innocently. So there's lots of people who've said, I tried it because I'm not a breakfast person anyway. So I felt like it was going to be easy for me to just have my coffee and go about my day. But what happens is that it increases the focus on food. So you're now thinking about food all the time because you're paying attention to the clock, you're watching this window, you're making sure to eat in your window, and sometimes eating not because you're hungry, but because you can, because it's your window. And a lot of people end up developing binge-like behaviors as a result of trying to tightly control their eating window. And the evidence that we have is that fasting isn't special. It's not any shinier than any other way of controlling calories. And even the evidence like that people were really excited about 10 and 15 years ago, looking at kind of like anti-aging benefits and things, has not panned out as, a significant benefit. I just tell them like it is not worth the time and effort and possible side effects to your relationship with food to try and condense this eating window. Even if on the surface it feels like it's going to be easier because you're not controlling the what, you're just controlling the when, it is going to end up like any other diet, which is you feeling like you're having to follow a rule and that you're having a hard time doing it and eventually giving up and feeling bad.
Yeah. And on the topic of food rules, one of the things that I find is that what diet culture has done is it's given us all these rules, right? And we try to follow them. And what we're actually doing is we're outsourcing our ability to feed ourselves, which is a deeply fine-tuned machine that has allowed human beings to survive through all kinds of horrific conditions The reasons we still have humans on the earth is because we have this tightly regulated system that tells us to eat more when we're hungry and tells us that we're full when we've had enough. And what I see is that most of us have outsourced all of that to strangers on the internet who might have great credentials, like, yes, they're doctors or nutritionists, and that's fantastic, but they don't live in your body. They don't live in your life. They're not there when you had a shitty sleep and your kid's throwing a tantrum. They're not there for any of that. Yeah. And so what I find frustrating is that women have completely lost trust in their ability to know when to eat, what to eat, and what works best for them, which is why the idea of intuitive eating sounds so terrifying to most women, because they're like, I can't be trusted. Yep. If I eat whatever I want, I'm going to eat cookies and burgers and pizza. How is that healthy? And part of what I've experienced and part of what I try to communicate, and that's why I'm glad we have time for this conversation, because this is a really hard conversation to have in a 30-minute appointment with someone to like, let's undo 48 years of diet culture and start intuitive eating. But when you start to trust yourself and you trust that your body wants to be healthy and you trust that your body is trying to guide you, it can completely change your relationship with food, where, like you said, it just becomes like, I just need to eat 3 times a day. What's going to work well for me today? As opposed to this constant like energy suck of can't eat the bread, can't eat this, can't eat that. So anyways, that's my big long rant on that. But it just like, it drives me bananas. And I always joke, I'm like, when I meet a woman, I want to do 2 things. I want to hug her and be like, I'm sorry that you grew up in diet culture. And I want to shake her and be like, it's time to wake up. Like I get it. And like, can we please move out of this? Like, craziness.
I love the analogy of outsourcing, because that's exactly what it is. And, you know, I will sometimes relate it to like, do you compare how often you go to the bathroom to someone else? You know how uncomfortable it gets if you have to pee and you keep pushing that off and off and off. Eventually, you've got to drop everything and run. And that's not a comfortable feeling. It's the same with food. So yes, this process of needing to refuel is a well-oiled machine. We need to trust when our body is saying, hey, I'm hungry. And if we can learn to listen to what it feels like to feel comfortably full and satisfied. And if we do that with this foundation of unconditional permission to eat, you don't have to earn it. You don't have to count it. You don't have to track it. You don't have to justify it. You know, you have unconditional permission to eat. It becomes very intuitive to just eat in that regular rhythm. Now, does that mean that sometimes you eat too little or too much? Yep, it does, because it doesn't have to be perfect. But you can learn to trust and develop body trust, even if you're coming from a lifetime of dieting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So if there's a woman listening, she did her like closet clean out. She tried on the jeans. They're not fitting. She's real pissed about it. She doesn't want to buy the new jeans. Like, what are some like maybe like top 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you would love for that woman to hear or to think about with regard to her changing body?
Yeah. And this is the harder work is, you know, one is the food piece, but the other is the body piece. And so I often, you know, reflect a lot of the work of Christina Bruce, who's a fabulous body acceptance coach, where, you know, she really reminds us to realize that these are just thoughts. And thinking about like the sky, the thought that you have about your body when those jeans don't fit, it's just a thought. And if you can see it as like, it'll pass, it feels really uncomfortable in that moment, but it's going to pass. Then we can maybe not go down the spiral, the shame spiral, the hate spiral, the, oh my God, I have to do something right now in this moment spiral. Because if we can press pause in that moment and say, this is uncomfortable, and ask ourselves, how can I take care of my body today instead of how can I lose weight? it keeps us moving forward in that body acceptance, body kindness, body trust direction. And the fact that the genes don't fit doesn't have real meaning other than the meaning you give it. And so I love how Brene Brown talks about like emotional granularity. And so I relate this back to saying, I feel fat. Fat isn't a feeling. What else is it? Like, look at that list of 73 or 87 emotions and really drill it down to like, what does this act of trying on these jeans and them not fitting, how does that make me feel? And then I think you can really start to address like the root cause, which is, why is it uncomfortable that my body is changing? Why am I having a hard time with it? And what is the feeling that I'm trying to avoid? And so, yeah, it's harder work than the food piece often, but it is also, I think, what helps people to get to that next level of food freedom is accepting that their body is good regardless. That it doesn't have to be smaller in order for them to feel good in it. And anybody who has yo-yo dieted, and certainly that would be me too, the feelings that I had in a smaller body when I was having a bad body image day were the exact same feelings I had in a larger body. So it's not about the body. It's the feelings, it's the pattern, it's the series of events that happen when you go down a trapdoor, when you find yourself caught unawares, whether it's a picture, a reflection, trying on clothes. And so understanding how that process is happening and why is probably how I would do it.
I love that advice. And that's what I always try to get at too with the patients I work with. Like, why do you want the weight loss? Because usually what we want is to feel something different. Mm-hmm. Either, like you said, to avoid something that we don't want to feel, or to feel something that feels good. And when you can figure out what those things are, you don't have to wait for the weight. You can detach it from the body. If what you want to feel is confident and energized, what can you do today to help you feel confident and energized? Why are we waiting for some like magical body change that may or may not happen, that also probably won't even give you what you're actually looking for? So I love that advice, right? So much of it is driven by mindset, because that really is such a big part of what, like, babies are not born hating their bodies. Babies are not born thinking skinnier is better. These are all things we've learned. And if we've learned them, it also means we can unlearn them. And that's why I think the work that you're doing is so important, because you really are such a powerful voice in this space where you're reminding women that their body is not the most interesting thing about them, and that they can love and support and accept their bodies no matter the shape, the size, or the weight, and that they can develop this like healthier relationship with food and their body. And I think like that's a gift I would love every woman to give herself as she goes through this transition, because the thought of like you being in your 80s and 90s and still worrying about this, again, to me, is such a waste of our precious life. Yeah. It's a waste of our precious energy. And so I really hope that if you're listening today, that you are, walking away with maybe a different appreciation for what happens to bodies in this age and stage, that, like Jenn said, you are not broken. It's just your body is prepping for a different stage of life. And that means that it's going to prioritize different things. It's not going to look and feel the same as it did when it was primed for baby making. Jenn, I want to thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. You please go and follow Jenn. She's on Instagram at menopause.nutritionist. Any last words that you want to leave our listeners with today?
I just love reminding people that menopause is just the end of your period. It's not the end of you. And there is so much, I'm on the postmenopausal side now, and I wouldn't go back for anything. There is a freedom to this age and stage that I wish for everyone. So
Thank you. Yeah, I had a patient yesterday. She's like, menopause was a huge gift, right? What a beautiful way to like think about this stage. And again, I think it can be that if we approach it in a different way. So thank you for tuning in today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And yes, let's really work on accepting our bodies as they change, because they're going to change. Because I think the opposite to that is, like I've said so many times, wasting our precious time and energy trying to shrink ourselves and make us smaller. And while we have our heads down, like staring at the scale or worrying about our waist size, we're missing out. We're missing out on our life. Yeah. We're missing out on our family. We're missing out on being in pictures with our kids because we don't want to be seen in a photograph. We're erasing ourselves in more than one way. And I would like for us to not do that. I want us to show up fully, full-bodied, full energy, full whatever that looks like for you, because to me, that is such a better use of our time here. So,
agreed.
Yay. Let's leave it at that. Thanks for spending your precious time with me today. Remember, it takes a village or a podcast community to really make a dent in this fatigue epidemic. If today's episode resonated with you, do me a favor. Share it with a friend or two, and if you have a second, drop us that shiny 5-star review. It means so much to me. Are you eager to solve your own personal energy puzzle? Hop on over to fatiguefixer.ca/quiz and check out my fatigue fingerprint quiz. Let's pinpoint what's standing between you and feeling your best. A big thank you to Jenn Hudson and Drew Gardner over at Story Studio Network for bringing these conversations to life. And hey, just so you know, I've got your back. Your fatigue, it's super real, and it's definitely not just all in your mind. I see you and I believe you. Every 2 weeks, we'll keep these heart-to-hearts going, learning together and cheering each other on. Because between you and me, accepting perpetual exhaustion as the norm, that's not going to fly around here. See you back here in 2 weeks. Bye!